The morning Margaret Rhodes buried her husband, the sky over Caldwell, Kansas, was the color of a bruised purple and yellow, and sick-looking at the edges, the way it gets in late October of 1882 when the season hasn't quite decided whether it wants to be autumn or something crueler. She had not cried yet. That was the strangest part of it, the part that people would talk about later over their supper tables and across their fence posts. Margaret Rhodes, they would say. She stood there at that graveside without a single tear on her face. And they would say it the way people say things when they don't understand grief, when they've confused composure for coldness and survival for indifference. But the truth was simpler and sadder than any of their gossip. Margaret had not cried because she was too busy holding her son upright. Thomas was 6 years old, and he had his father's brown eyes, and his father's way of going very still when something was wrong, like an animal that senses the weather changing before the clouds roll in. He stood beside his mother at the graveside with his small hand wrapped around two of her fingers, and he didn't make a sound, not one sound, and that silence from a 6-year-old boy was the hardest thing Margaret had ever heard in her life. William Rhodes had died of a fever. It had come on fast, the way fevers sometimes do in the fall when a man has been working too hard and sleeping too little, and within a week of the first cough he was gone. He'd been 31 years old. He'd been a decent man. He'd been kind to her and kind to Thomas, and he'd had plans for the little homestead they'd built on the edge of town, plans involving a second barn and a proper well and maybe someday a parlor with real glass windows instead of oilcloth over the frames. Now all of those plans were in the ground with him. The preacher, Reverend Aldous Hatch, had read the 23rd Psalm with the particular kind of practiced solemnity that good preachers develop after years of standing over too many graves. Margaret had listened to every word and understood none of them, because her mind had been occupied with the immediate practical problem of what she was going to do now. She was 28 years old. She had $42 in a tin box under the floorboards of the bedroom. She had a homestead with a leaking roof and a horse named Clover who was getting old. She had a 6-year-old son and no family within 300 miles. And she had 2 weeks before the first frost would come down from the north and make everything harder. She was not a woman who fell apart. She had been raised in Missouri by a father who believed that hardship was simply the normal condition of living, and that complaining about it was a waste of breath. She had come west at 20 with William, and she had built a life here out of nothing but work and stubbornness, and she intended to keep building it. But even the most capable woman in the world could not do the work of 2 people alone on a homestead in winter with a small child to tend. And in the quiet of those first nights after William died, lying awake in the bed they had shared for 7 years listening to Thomas breathe in the next room, Margaret let herself feel the full weight of how alone she was. The Sunday after the burial, Reverend Hatch had announced that there would be a special service to pray for the Rhodes family, and the community of Caldwell had turned out in the way that small communities do when tragedy strikes one of their own, not entirely out of kindness, though kindness was present, but also out of that complicated mixture of sympathy and relief that runs through people when they think, "At least it is not me." Margaret had not planned to attend. She had planned to stay home with Thomas and see to the endless list of chores that had backed up during the week of William's illness, but Thomas had looked up at her over his breakfast and said, very seriously, "Papa liked church," and she had found herself putting on her black dress and taking his hand and walking the half-mile into town. She had not wanted to sit in the pews. The thought of sitting in the middle of all those people watching her, feeling their eyes on the back of her neck, fielding the expressions of sympathy that she was not yet sure she could receive without breaking, it was too much. She had gone in through the front door, taken one look at the rows of faces turning toward her, and quietly backed herself and Thomas to the far rear wall of the church. Standing against the whitewashed pine boards the way a person stands against a wall when they feel the room is about to tip. She had not planned to shake, but her body had its own ideas about what was happening, And somewhere between walking through the door and pressing her back against that wall, the shaking had started. Not the kind of shaking that shows from the outside, not wild trembling, not the shaking of a woman falling to pieces, but the deep interior kind, the kind that starts in the core of you and radiates outward in slow, relentless waves, the kind that comes when your body finally understands something your mind has been refusing to accept. She was alone. She was truly, completely alone, and she did not know how she was going to do this. Thomas felt it. He was 6 and he felt it the way children feel things, not through analysis but through some direct animal connection to the people they love. And his small hand tightened around hers and he looked up at her with those brown eyes that were too much like his father's, and she felt the shaking get worse. The congregation had settled. The reverend had begun to speak. Margaret stared at the back of the nearest pew and concentrated very hard on the grain of the wood, the way the lines ran in parallel and then curved and then ran parallel again. And she told herself, "You are not going to cry here. You are not going to fall apart in front of all these people. You are going to stand here and listen, and then you are going to walk home, and you are going to figure out what to do next." She was so focused on not falling apart that she didn't notice at first when the movement happened. There were perhaps 60 people in the church that morning, maybe a few more. The pews were full. Near the middle on the right side, about 6 rows from the back, a man had been sitting alone. He was big, not in a threatening way, but in the way of a man who works outdoors, whose body has been shaped by physical labor into something solid and uncomplaining. He wore a clean shirt that had been pressed with some effort and dark trousers, and his hat was on the pew beside him, which meant he had manners. His hair was dark, shot through at the temples with early gray, and his face was the kind of face that takes the sun well and keeps it, brown and weathered in a way that makes a person look older than they might be. She did not know his name. She had seen him in town a few times in the general store, once at the feed yard, but Caldwell was growing, and she had not made as many acquaintances as she should have, and this man was one she had noticed without ever learning. He had been sitting in his pew listening to the reverend when something had made him turn. She did not know what. Perhaps he had heard the door. Perhaps he had some instinct for distress the way certain people do, the way some horses will stop and look at something no one else has seen yet. Whatever the reason, he had turned, and he had seen her standing at the back of the church with her boy, and he had seen whatever was showing on her face and in the line of her body. And then he had done something that no one else did, something that no one else seemed to have thought to do. He had stood up from his pew quietly, without any fuss, without drawing attention to himself any more than he could help, and he had walked to the back of the church and stood beside her. He hadn't said anything. He hadn't touched her. He had simply taken his place beside her against that rear wall, his hat held in both hands at his waist, and he had looked forward at the reverend as if this was exactly where he had intended to be all along. Margaret had stared at him for a moment with something close to shock. He had looked down at her then, just briefly, and his eyes were gray, not cold gray, but the gray of overcast sky before it decides to clear, and he had given her a small nod, the kind of nod that says, "I see you, and I am not going anywhere, and you do not have to explain anything." She had looked back at the reverend. The shaking did not stop all at once, but it began slowly to loosen its grip. Thomas had looked up at the man beside them with frank curiosity, the way 6-year-olds look at things without any of the social caution that adults develop, and the man had looked down at the boy, and something in his face had shifted, something careful and gentle. And he had given Thomas the same small nod he'd given Margaret, man to man, which was perhaps the most perfect thing he could have done, because Thomas had straightened up a little after that, as if the nod had given him some permission to be steadier than he felt. When the service ended and the congregation began to move and mill and talk, the man had turned to her properly for the first time. "Ralph Donnelly," he said. His voice was low and even, like distant thunder that hasn't decided yet whether it will come your way. "Margaret Rhodes," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry about your husband, Mrs. Rhodes. He was a good man." "Did you know him?" "Some. I bought a horse from him last spring, spent an afternoon at your place." "Good man," he said again, and there was nothing performative about it, none of the hollow repetition of condolence, only a simple, honest statement of fact. "Thank you," she said. Thomas was looking up at Ralph Donnelly with those wide brown eyes, and Ralph looked down at him again. "How old are you, son?" "6, Thomas said. "6," Ralph repeated, as if that was a respectable number. "That's a good age." Thomas considered this seriously. "Were you 6 once?" The corner of Ralph's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "I was, long time ago." The Reverend came through the crowd then and took Margaret's hands in both of his and said the things reverends say, and people gathered around her with their casseroles and their sympathies. And in the shuffle and press of it, Ralph Donnelly stepped back and was absorbed into the crowd. And by the time Margaret had finished receiving condolences and looked around for him, he was gone. She thought about him on the walk home. She thought about the simple, unremarkable act of a man standing up from his pew and walking to the back of a church to stand beside a woman he barely knew, and she found that she could not stop thinking about it, because in her experience, people very rarely did the precise right thing at the precise right moment without being asked, and this man had done it without even seeming to think about it. She told herself it meant nothing. He was being neighborly. This was the West, and out here people helped their neighbors, or at least they were supposed to. She tucked the thought away and turned her attention to the leaking roof and the $42 and the horse and the boy and the winter that was coming. But she did not forget him. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Margaret's life, and that was saying something, because her life had not been short on hard weeks. The roof required immediate attention. 2 of the shingles had gone and water was coming in over the bedroom, and she did not have the money to hire it fixed, and she did not have the knowledge to fix it herself, though she was determined to learn. She patched it with a piece of canvas tarpaulin in the meantime, and told herself it would do until she figured out something better. She took in laundry. 3 families in Caldwell agreed to bring their washing to her, and she spent her mornings at the washboard with Thomas playing nearby, her hands going red and raw in the cold water, and she counted the coins carefully and added them to the tin box, and told herself that 42 was becoming 50 and 50 would become more and more was survival. She also began to look seriously at the question of the homestead itself. The land was good. William had chosen well, 50 acres with decent soil, and a creek that ran reliable through spring, but 50 acres needed working, and she couldn't work it alone and keep up with the house and the laundry and Thomas. She had to be honest with herself about that. Something would have to give. She had been thinking about this problem one Thursday morning in early November, standing at the fence line looking at the frost-stiffened field and trying to calculate how much she could plant in spring if she focused on just one crop, when she heard hooves on the road and looked up. Ralph Donnelly was riding a bay horse down the road toward her homestead. He was leading a second horse behind him, a solid-looking roan, and he had tools bundled across the roan's back. She could see the handles of a hammer and what looked like a long saw. She watched him come up to the fence and stop. "Mrs. Rhodes," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Donnelly." He looked at the house, specifically at the canvas tarp she'd tied over the corner of the roof, and his expression did the thing where it stayed very still but something moved behind it. "I heard you had roof trouble," he said. "I am managing it." "I expect you are," he said. "But it's going to snow before the end of the month and that canvas won't hold under weight." He paused. "I have the day free and I have shingles. Bought extra last spring for my own roof and didn't need them all. They're just sitting." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She was not a woman who liked owing people things. She had been raised to believe that accepting help made you beholden, and being beholden was a kind of vulnerability she had always been careful to avoid. "What do you want for them?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression, not offense exactly, but close to it, and then it passed. "Nothing," he said. "Neighbors help neighbors. Mr. Donnelly misses." "Rhodes," he said, and there was something very patient in the way he said it, the way a person sounds when they have decided that they are going to say a thing plainly and see what happens. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I have extra shingles and you need shingles and it is going to snow. That's all." She looked at the tarp. She looked at the sky, which did have that particular white flatness that precedes snow. She looked back at Ralph Donnelly on his horse with his patient gray eyes. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He was on the roof by 9 o'clock. Thomas stood in the yard below and watched him with absolute fascination, and every few minutes he would call up some question. "How do you know where to put the nail? How do you not fall off? Is it scary up there?" And Ralph would answer each question with the same unhurried thoughtfulness, as if he had all the time in the world and a 6-year-old's questions were the most natural thing to be attending to. Margaret brought coffee out at noon and set it on the fence post, and Ralph came down the ladder and took it with both hands and drank it standing in the thin winter sun, and Thomas stood beside him with his arms crossed in imitation of a man at rest, and the sight of it hit Margaret somewhere in the sternum like a slow, warm pressure. "You're good with children," she said, before she could stop herself. Ralph looked at Thomas, who had now abandoned the arms-crossed posture and was examining something in the dirt with intense focus. "He's a good boy," he said, clear-eyed, like his mother. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the silence between them was comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. He finished the roof before 3 o'clock and came down and packed his tools with methodical care, and she paid him for the shingles themselves. She insisted on that, worked out a fair price and pressed the coins into his hand and dared him with her eyes to give them back, and he had looked at the coins for a moment and then closed his hand around them. "Fair enough," he said. "Will you stay for supper?" The words came out before she had thought them through, and she felt a brief flicker of something embarrassment maybe, or something less easily named, but she kept her expression steady and let the invitation stand. He had paused, looking at her with those gray eyes, and she had the sense that he was measuring something, weighing it carefully. "I wouldn't want to impose," he said. "It's soup," she said. "There's plenty." He stayed. He sat at her small kitchen table across from Thomas and ate beef and potato soup, with the kind of sincere appetite that is the best compliment a cook can receive. And Thomas talked the entire time about school, about his friend Jimmy Albright who had a dog that could do tricks, about the fact that he had recently learned that the earth was round, and found this information both exciting and suspicious. Ralph listened to all of it with genuine attention, asking questions at the right moments, and Margaret sat at the end of the table and watched the two of them and felt something she could not entirely identify, warm and aching at the same time, the way a cold hand feels when it's finally brought in from the frost. After Thomas had gone to bed, Ralph helped her clear the table. She tried to tell him he didn't need to, and he'd simply picked up the bowls and carried them to the wash basin, and they'd stood in the kitchen in the lamplight, and she'd said, "You have your own spread." "A small one," he said. "North of town about 3 miles. More cattle than land, really. I run about 40 head. Alone." "Alone," he said. "That's a lot of work alone." "It is," he said, and didn't offer anything more, and she didn't push. He left before it got dark, which was the right thing to do, and she stood in the doorway and watched him ride north in the fading light, and told herself that a man helping with a roof was simply a man helping with a roof, that it was neighborly and nothing more, and that she was not going to let herself make anything complicated out of simple human decency. She told herself this several times over the next few weeks, because Ralph Donnelly kept finding reasons to be useful. He brought firewood the following week, said he'd cut extra, and needed to clear some space in his shed, which she suspected was not entirely true, but accepted without argument because the woodpile was genuinely low. He fixed the hinge on her barn door the week after that because he'd happened to ride by and noticed it hanging crooked. He took Thomas with him to the feed store one Saturday morning when he went to pick up grain, and came back with the boy sitting up on the horse in front of him looking like he'd been handed the world's greatest present, his face bright with something Margaret hadn't seen there in weeks. She was grateful. She was also increasingly aware that gratitude was not the only thing she felt when she watched Ralph Donnelly move through her property with quiet competence, fixing things and hauling things, and talking to her son as if Thomas's opinions about the proper naming of a working horse were matters of genuine importance. But she was also aware, and this awareness was persistent and disciplined, because Margaret was a disciplined woman, that she was 7 weeks out from burying her husband. She was not a woman to be careless with her heart or anyone else's, and she had a child to think about, and a homestead to hold together, and the luxury of indulging in what she felt in her chest when Ralph smiled his slow, rare smile was not something she could afford. So she kept things steady. She was warm but careful. She was grateful without being effusive. She was, she told herself, a practical woman dealing practically with a man who was being practically kind, and that was all. Ralph, for his part, seemed to understand. He did not push. He was present but not intrusive, helpful but not hovering, and he had a quality of patience about him that felt like something deliberate, something chosen rather than merely temperamental. It was Reverend Hatch who told her, one afternoon in December when she stopped by the church to pay her respects before the month ended, some things about Ralph Donnelly's history. "He came out from Virginia about 4 years ago," the Reverend said, with the careful tone of a man offering information rather than gossip. "He had a wife. She passed in childbirth along with the baby. He doesn't talk about it, but everyone in town knows. He came west to start over, I suppose, the way people do." Margaret stood very still in the cold doorway of the church and absorbed this information. "He's a good man," the Reverend said simply, and then changed the subject. She thought about it all the way home. She thought about the look in Ralph's eyes when he watched Thomas, something careful and glad and a little pained all at once, and she understood it differently now. She thought about the way he occupied her kitchen with the ease of a man who remembered what it was like to be in a home, and the specific quality of his solitude, which was not the solitude of a man who had never wanted different but of one who had lost it. She did not say anything to him about it. It was not her information to have, and he had not given it to her, and she was not going to bring it out into the light when he had clearly chosen to keep it private. But she held it in herself, and it changed something in the way she understood him. Christmas came quiet and cold. Margaret made Thomas a wooden horse. She'd been working on it for 3 weeks, carving it from a piece of oak in the evenings after Thomas slept, learning as she went and cutting her fingers twice. And on Christmas morning he'd held it with both hands and turned it over and over and then looked up at her with those brown eyes full and said, "Did you make this, Mama?" And she'd said yes, and he'd said, "Papa would have liked it." And she had held herself together through sheer force of will until Thomas went outside to play in the snow, and then she had sat at the kitchen table and cried for the first time since William died. She cried for a long time. She cried for William and for Thomas, and for the plans that were in the ground, and for the loneliness of the December morning, and for the fact that she had done the best she could, and the best she could felt very thin. She cried until she felt emptied out and scoured clean, and then she wiped her face and stood up and put water on to heat for coffee and told herself, "Now you can go on." Ralph brought gifts that afternoon, a peppermint stick for Thomas and a small bag of coffee beans for Margaret, which was exactly the right gift because she had been rationing her coffee for weeks and he had apparently noticed. She thanked him at the door. He looked at her face, at the traces of what the morning had been, and he didn't ask. But his hand, just for a moment, just briefly covered hers where it rested on the door frame, and he held it there for the space of 2 breaths before letting go. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it like a small stone dropped into still water. "Merry Christmas, Ralph," she said. The new year arrived with a blizzard that locked everything down for 5 days and left Caldwell muffled and white and blinding. Ralph did not come by during those days, couldn't, with the roads impassable, and Margaret found herself noticing his absence in a way she couldn't dismiss as practical. She caught herself looking out the north window toward the road more than once, and she caught herself doing it and made herself stop and concentrate on something else, but the noticing persisted. When the roads opened and he came by on the 6th day to check that she and Thomas were all right, she opened the door and felt something in her chest unknot, and she thought, "This is a problem." Not a problem she was angry about. More like a problem she recognized with a kind of resigned clarity, the way you recognize that a creek is going to flood when you see the snowpack on the mountains above it. Something was going to happen. She could not prevent the snowpack from melting. She could only decide what to do when the water came down. She invited him in for coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and she looked at him across it, the good, weathered face, the gray eyes, the hands wrapped around the coffee mug, and she said, "You have been very kind to us." He looked at her steadily. "I've done what needed doing. You've done more than that." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Thomas was making something in the snow, his voice coming in through the walls in bursts. "I'm not trying to replace anything," Ralph said carefully. "Or anyone." "I know that," she said. I like coming here," he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, something stripped of its usual evenness, something that cost him something to say. "I like this kitchen and I like that boy out there and I like talking to you. It's been a long time since I liked being somewhere." She looked at him for a long, careful moment. "How long has it been," she said, "since you lost her?" His expression shifted, and she saw him understand that she knew. 3 years, he said. "Reverend Hatch." He wasn't gossiping. He was telling me something he thought I should know. "I'm sorry, Ralph. I'm sorry about your wife and your child." The muscle in his jaw tightened for a moment and then released. "Thank you," he said. They sat for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have just shown each other something true. "I am not ready," she said, and she said it clearly and honestly because she felt he deserved clarity and honesty. "I don't know when I will be. I may be difficult and strange about it when it happens. I have a son to think about and a property to hold together, and there are days when I can barely." She stopped. "I am telling you this because I think you deserve to know where things stand." Ralph set down his coffee mug. He looked at her with those serious gray eyes. "I know where things stand," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything, Margaret. I'm not in a hurry. I'm not going anywhere." He paused. "I'm just here." She held that, "just here. The simplest possible thing and the most necessary." "All right," she said. Spring came slowly to Caldwell and then all at once, the way it does in Kansas, and with it came the work of the season, planting, mending, the 1,000 tasks that winter holds in reserve and deposits on your doorstep in March. Margaret had thought hard over the winter about the homestead and had decided to plant corn on the south field and keep the north field for a kitchen garden and the hay cutting that would feed Clover through the next winter. It was ambitious for one person, but she had a plan and she had learned over the winter to be ambitious. Ralph helped with the planting, turning up soil with a draft horse he brought from his own property, working alongside her in the long spring days, while Thomas followed behind them and dropped seeds in the furrows with the solemn concentration of a child given an important task. The three of them ate lunch in the field on good days, sitting on the wagon bed with bread and salt pork, and the cold creek water Margaret kept in a jug, and the prairie spread out around them under that enormous Kansas sky. And it felt like something she had not let herself name yet, but that was starting to take shape in the back of her mind like a landscape emerging through fog. There was a day in April, a Tuesday, warm and windy, when Thomas was at school and Margaret and Ralph were working on the fence line along the east side of the property. The posts had heaved in the winter frost and needed resetting, and they'd been working for 2 hours in comfortable near silence, and Margaret straightened up to rest her back and found Ralph watching her. Not the way that makes a woman uncomfortable, the way that makes a woman feel seen. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. You're remarkable," she laughed, a short surprised sound. "I'm fixing fence posts." "You've held this place together through a hard winter, alone with a child, and you haven't fallen apart, and you haven't asked for pity, And you're out here setting fence posts in April like it's the most natural thing in the world." His voice was quiet, matter of fact. "I find that remarkable." She looked at him for a moment, this man she had known for 5 months now, and she thought about the back of a church and the gray of his eyes and the patience he had wrapped around himself like a coat and never let slip. "Ralph," she said, "Margaret." "I think I would like you to kiss me," she said, and the words surprised her even as she said them, coming from somewhere below thought, from the place where she had been storing all the warmth and the want for these 5 careful months. He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved through his face, surprise, and then something enormous and held back, like a door opening. He crossed the space between them and he kissed her, and it was not a tentative kiss, not the careful, restrained thing she might have expected from such a careful, restrained man. It was a real kiss, unhurried and certain, and she kissed him back with everything she had been keeping in reserve, and the April wind moved across the prairie around them, and the fence posts stood half reset and neither of them cared. When they separated, he kept his hands on her face, his thumbs resting against her cheekbones, looking at her with those gray eyes that were no longer overcast at all but bright. "I have been wanting to do that since October," he said. She put her hands over his. "I know," she said. "I have been wanting it too. What do we do now? We finish the fence posts," she said, "and then we figure out the rest." He laughed then, a real laugh, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, and it was a good sound. They did finish the fence posts, and then they figured out the rest. It was not without its complications. Thomas was the first and most important of them. He was 7 now, and while he had taken to Ralph with the ease and openness of a child who had been shown kindness and responded to it naturally, the question of what Ralph meant in his life, what word to attach to him, what role was delicate and required handling. It was Thomas who raised it himself, with characteristic directness, one evening in May when Ralph had stayed for supper, and the 3 of them were on the porch watching the sky go red in the west. "Are you going to marry my mama?" Thomas asked, looking at Ralph with the forthright confidence of a boy who has decided that a direct question is better than wondering. There was a silence. Margaret felt heat in her face. Ralph looked at Thomas with that expression he had, serious and genuine, fully attending to the child, and then he looked at Margaret. "I would like to," he said, "if she will have me." Thomas considered this with great seriousness. Then he looked at his mother. "Will you?" Margaret looked at her son, who had his father's brown eyes and her stubbornness, and who deserved every good thing the world could give him. "I am still thinking about it," she said, which was not entirely true, but she was not yet ready to let the question be settled on the porch by a 7-year-old boy. Thomas accepted this as reasonable. "Don't take too long," he advised, and went back to watching the sunset. Ralph looked at Margaret with a look of perfect suppressed amusement, and she covered her mouth with her hand to keep from laughing, and the laugh came out anyway, warm and real. He did not push her. He asked her, formally and properly, on an evening in June. He came to the house at dusk with his hat in his hands and asked if he could speak with her, and they sat on the porch steps, and he told her that he loved her, said it plain, without decoration. In the straightforward way he said everything, and that he understood she was not just deciding about him but about everything, about the future of her home and her son's life, and the kind of person she wanted to build the next part of her life with, and that whatever she decided, he would respect it. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, the same words as before, "but I want you to know what I'm hoping for." She had been sitting with her hands folded in her lap looking at the last light on the corn, which was coming in strong and green this year, better than she dared hope. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for a while. I've been afraid to say it because it seemed like saying it meant committing to something, and committing to something meant being brave enough to lose again." "I know," he said. "I've been afraid of the same thing." She looked at him. "Are you still afraid?" "Yes," he said. "But less than I am sure about you." She took a breath. "Then yes," she said. "My answer is yes." He closed his eyes for a moment, and she saw what it meant to him. saw it move through him like the release of something held too long, and then he opened his eyes and looked at her and smiled. The full smile, not the half-suggestion of one, but the real thing, and it transformed his face into something that made her feel like the June evening was inside her chest. They were married in September, nearly a year after Margaret had first stood at the back of that church shaking, and it was a small wedding because Margaret wanted it that way. She was not a woman who needed a spectacle, but it was full, the way small things can be full, the way a small room can be warm. Reverend Hatch performed the ceremony, and his voice was gentle and genuine without any of the professional gravity he'd used at the graveside. Thomas stood beside Ralph as if he belonged there, because he did belong there, and when the Reverend said the words that made things official, Thomas looked up at Ralph with an expression that Margaret would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. After the ceremony, when the small gathering of friends had eaten cake and drunk the good cider Margaret had pressed from the apple trees behind the church, Thomas had tugged Ralph's sleeve and Ralph had crouched down to his level, and Thomas had put his arms around Ralph's neck, and Ralph had held him, and Margaret had looked away because she did not want to cry in front of everyone, and she could tell she was going to. She cried later, in the private of their shared bedroom, but they were the good kind of tears, the kind that come from fullness rather than depletion. The first winter of their marriage was different from the winter before it in ways both practical and fundamental. The work was shared, which meant that it was done, all of it, without the grinding exhaustion of doing it alone. The roof that Ralph had fixed the previous October held perfectly against the November snows. The firewood was abundant. The barn was tight. The $42 in the tin box had become considerably more, between her laundry work and his cattle operation, and they were beginning to talk about real plans. The second barn William had dreamed of, the proper well, maybe even the glass windows for the parlor. But more than the practical, there was the warmth of being not alone. Margaret had not known, until she experienced its opposite, how much she had been carrying in the solitude of that first autumn and winter. There was the warmth of another voice in the kitchen, of decisions made together rather than alone, of waking in the night to the sound of someone else breathing in the dark and knowing you were not the only thing standing between your child and the cold. Ralph was not William. She had not wanted him to be, and he had never tried to be. He was himself, thoroughly and consistently steady and patient, and occasionally too quiet, prone to working too long without eating if he got absorbed in a task, unexpectedly funny in a dry, understated way that she had learned to watch for. He had his own grief and his own history, and he wore it differently than she wore hers, more internally, more quietly. But she had learned to read him, and she could tell when it came up in him, and she had learned how to be near him when it did without making him feel watched. And she loved him. She loved him the way you love something you chose with open eyes, fully knowing the risk and deciding the risk was worth it. She loved his hands and his patience and the way he talked to Thomas. She loved that he had stood up from a church pew once for a woman he barely knew because it was the right thing to do, and he was a man who did right things without needing to be asked. Thomas flourished. This was the thing that made Margaret most certain she had done the right thing, not her own happiness, though that mattered, but watching her son flourish. Thomas had always been a good boy, but there had been a gravity in him since his father's death, a watchfulness, a kind of premature seriousness that had worried her in the way that quiet worried parents sometimes more than crying. With Ralph in the house, that gravity began to lift. Not all at once, not completely. Thomas had his father's brown eyes and his father's temperament, and some of his father's serious quality would always be part of him, and that was right and good, but the lightness came back too. He laughed more. He ran more. He argued with Ralph about whether the brown horse or the bay horse was faster with the passionate conviction of a child who has found a safe adult to argue with. They celebrated Thomas's 8th birthday in February, with a chocolate cake that Ralph had ridden to the next town to get cocoa for. because Caldwell's general store had run out. Thomas had eaten 2 slices and declared it the best cake in the history of cakes, and then sat at the table with one hand resting on Ralph's arm the way children rest on the people they feel safe with, unconsciously, as if they don't know they're doing it. Margaret watched this and thought, yes, this is what I chose. Spring came again, the second spring, and with it came something else, the particular knowledge that a woman who has been through it once recognizes immediately, the knowledge that she held close for 2 weeks before she told Ralph, wanting to be certain. She told him on a morning in April in the kitchen, while he was pouring coffee. She said it simply because she had learned that the simple, direct way was the way with him. He set the coffee pot down very carefully on the stove, and then he turned and looked at her, and his face did something she had never seen it do before. It went completely unguarded, all the careful steadiness stripped away, and what was underneath was joy, pure and uncontained, and underneath that, just for a moment, fear. She went to him and put her arms around him and felt the tension in his body. "This time will be different," she said. "You don't know that. I know that we will face it together," she said. "Whatever happens, I won't be alone and neither will you." He held her for a long time without speaking, his face pressed against her hair. "I'm terrified," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm a little terrified too." "Are you happy?" She tilted her head back and looked at him. "I am very happy," she said. The fear did not leave entirely for either of them. It was a thread that ran through the pregnancy, present and acknowledged, because they were both adults who had been touched by loss and knew what was possible. Ralph was watchful without being smothering, and Margaret went out of her way to stay well, eating carefully, resting when she should, not pushing herself through exhaustion the way she had always been inclined to do. They talked about it sometimes late at night, lying in the dark, the quiet, honest conversations that marriage at its best makes possible. "Tell me about her," Margaret said to him once in the dark. "Your wife." A pause. "Eleanor," he said. "She was small, dark-haired, she laughed at everything." Another pause. "She would have liked you." "How do you know?" "Because she liked people who did things, people who didn't make a fuss." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been afraid since I've been afraid that loving you meant forgetting her. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like the heart is bigger than you thought," Margaret said. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." She reached in the dark and found his hand. "William would have liked you," she said. "He admired straightforward people, people who say what they mean." Ralph squeezed her hand. "We carry them with us," he said. "We do," she said. "And that's all right." Thomas took the news of the coming baby with the characteristic solemnity of a boy who processes large events slowly and then comes out the other side with a definitive opinion. His opinion, delivered one evening at supper several weeks after the announcement, was, "I would like a brother, but I will accept a sister if that's what happens." He said this with the air of a person making a formal concession, and Ralph had pressed his lips together very hard to keep from laughing. "That's very open-minded of you," Margaret said. "I've been thinking about it," Thomas said, with great seriousness. The baby came in November. Their first autumn together had come all the way around, and it came easier than Margaret had feared, though not easily, and Ralph was there the whole time, which had required some convincing of the midwife, Mrs. Garrett, who had firm opinions about where men belonged during childbirth. Ralph had looked at Mrs. Garrett with a look that Mrs. Garrett had later described to her friends as like a mountain deciding not to move, and he had stayed. It was a boy, red-faced and enormous-lunged and insistently alive, and Ralph held him in the crook of his arm and looked down at this child who was his and Margaret's both, and Margaret watched his face from the bed and saw the fear finally, fully dissolve. They named him James William Donnelly, James for Ralph's father and William for the man whose memory deserved to be carried forward. Thomas, upon meeting his brother, looked at him with critical assessment for a long moment. "He's smaller than I thought," Thomas said. "All babies are small," Margaret said. "He's very red." "He'll sort that out." Thomas reached out and touched the baby's hand, and the baby's hand closed around Thomas's finger, and Thomas went very still and looked up at his mother and stepfather with an expression of pure wonder. "He grabbed me," he said. "He knows you're his brother," Ralph said. Thomas looked back at the baby with something shifting visibly in his face, some last piece of 8-year-old reservation falling away. "Hello, James," he said, in a different voice, softer, already protective. "I'm Thomas. I'm going to show you everything." The years that followed were the years that built a life in the fullest sense of the word, not a life assembled from necessity and survival, though those things were in the foundation too, but a life chosen and constructed and inhabited with intention. The second barn went up in the spring after James was born, a real structure this time, built by Ralph and 2 hired hands and Margaret herself on the days when James slept long enough. Ralph expanded his cattle operation. He sold the small north property and bought land adjacent to Margaret's, combining the 2 spreads into something substantial, 60 acres that were properly theirs. The glass windows came the year Thomas turned 10, 4 panes for the parlor front, and Margaret stood in the parlor and watched the light come through them and felt something complete. Ralph taught Thomas to ride properly at 7, to rope at 9, to read the weather by 11. He was not a man who believed that a stepson was a lesser category of son, and he treated Thomas's education in the ways of the land with the same seriousness that he brought to everything, not urgent but consistent, day after day, year after year, the slow accumulation of knowledge transferred from one generation to the next the way it was always supposed to happen. Thomas called him Papa by the time he was 9. It had not been announced or negotiated. It had simply happened gradually the way seasons change, until one day it was the word and had always been the word. Ralph did not make a show of it when it happened the first time. He had simply looked at Thomas and answered the question Thomas had asked him as if it were entirely normal, which it was. It had become entirely normal. But later that night, lying in the dark, Margaret had felt his arm tighten around her. "You felt that," she said. "I felt it," he said. "Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," he said. I don't have the word for it." "Grateful," she said. "Grateful," he agreed. "And something bigger than that." James grew from red-faced infant to round-cheeked baby to a toddler of spectacular stubbornness and charm, with Margaret's gray eyes and Ralph's dark hair, and an opinion about everything that he had apparently arrived in the world already holding. He followed Thomas everywhere, and Thomas bore this with the particular exasperation and secret pride of an older sibling who would never admit how much he loved the following. Margaret had James measured at the doctor's office at 18 months and was told he was in excellent health and also quite tall for his age, which she had suspected from the rate at which he was going through shirts. "Like his father," she said. Ralph, who had been sitting in the waiting room when this was said and heard it through the open doorway, experienced a moment of such complete and undefended happiness that he had to look out the window for a moment to collect himself. In the spring of 1886, 4 years after they married, Margaret found herself thinking about the future in a way she had never let herself think about it in those early desperate days, not as survival but as expansion, as something that continued to grow and deepen. The homestead was solid, the cattle were doing well. Ralph had a reputation in the county as an honest man and a fair dealer, which was worth more than most things out here, and Margaret had become known as someone whose counsel was worth having, the kind of woman other women came to when they needed practical advice or a clear head. She helped where she could with the new families coming west, with the women in town who were trying to navigate life in a place that could be harder on them than it should have been. She was not blind to the inequities of the world she lived in, and she did not pretend to be. The West was supposed to be a place of new beginnings, and in some ways it was, but it was also a place where women could find themselves in the same position she had been in alone, without resources, dependent on the goodwill of neighbors who might or might not show up. She thought about the women who did not have a Ralph Donnelly standing up from his pew. She thought about them often, and when she could help, she did. She helped a woman named Clara Sims, who arrived in Caldwell in the spring of 1886 with 2 small children and no money and a husband who had abandoned her in Missouri. And she helped her find work and helped her negotiate a fair wage from the laundry that had opened on the east side of town. And she helped her find rooms. Ralph, when she told him what she was doing, had said simply, "Good," and that was all, and she had loved him very much for that. Thomas turned 13 that year and was becoming what would clearly be a very tall young man, and he had Ralph's particular quality of stillness and his mother's particular quality of determination, and both of these things were going to serve him well. He was helping with the cattle now in earnest, not child helping but genuine contribution, and Ralph had begun talking to him about the land and what it would mean someday, and what a man needed to know to maintain it. "He's a natural," Ralph told her one evening, watching Thomas work a horse in the corral. "Don't let him hear you say that," Margaret said. "His head is already nearly the size of the barn." Ralph glanced at her with that dry look. "That's your side of the family. Ralph Donnelly, you take that back." He did not take it back. He smiled instead, the full smile, the one that was still capable of affecting her the way it had when she first saw it in their second winter, and she looked at him across the fence post and thought, "This is the life. This is precisely it." There were hard times still, because the West was the West and life was life, and hard times did not stop coming simply because you had built something good. The drought of 1887 hit the county hard, and the corn failed that summer and the cattle lost weight and the creek went shallow enough to worry about, and they had to make careful decisions about money and sell some stock earlier than they'd wanted. They got through it because they got through it together, making lists and plans and contingencies, the way 2 people who trust each other can, without blame or fear, just problem solving. There was also the matter of Bob Crane, a land speculator who came through Caldwell in the fall of 1887, with papers that he claimed showed a prior lien on a portion of the combined Rhodes-Donnelly land. Papers that Ralph's lawyer in Wichita spent 3 weeks examining before concluding they were fraudulent, filed against a different property entirely and misrepresented. Crane was run out of town by the combined displeasure of several property owners he had tried the same approach on, and the episode was resolved, but it had been several weeks of real anxiety, and Ralph had spent a good deal of that time with his jaw set in the particular way that meant he was controlling something large and keeping it contained. "It's done," Margaret said to him the night the lawyer's letter came with the good news. "It is," he said. "You were worried." "I was not going to let someone take this land," he said, and there was something in his voice that was the quietest possible kind of fierceness, the fierceness of a man who has built something and intends to keep it. "I know," she said, "I wasn't going to either." He looked at her and the fierceness softened into something warm. "No," he said, "you weren't." He reached across the table and took her hand. "What would I do without you?" "You'd have significantly fewer clean windows," she said. He laughed the good deep laugh. "Come here," he said, and she went. James turned 5 in November of 1887 and became, seemingly overnight, a person of views and opinions and loud preferences, and the house felt full in the best possible way, full of voices and arguments about breakfast and the particular warmth that comes from a small boy who wants to be wherever his parents are. He had taken to following Ralph around the property in the mornings before breakfast, a tiny shadow of stubbornness in boots that were slightly too large, and Ralph bore this following with enormous patience and occasionally very funny weariness, and Margaret would watch from the kitchen window while she made coffee, and she would think, "This is it. This is the whole thing, right here in this yard." Thomas was 15 by the time Margaret found herself expecting again, which she told Ralph with slightly more composure than the first time, though she felt the same warm, rolling happiness, and Ralph's response was similar, the careful setting down of things, the looking at her with everything open but steadier because the fear was smaller now, tempered by the lived knowledge that things could go right. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. Thomas is going to be insufferably smug that he was right about wanting siblings, she said. Ralph's expression moved with that dry humor she knew so well. He's been right about a lot of things lately. It's becoming a habit. Thomas was, in fact, insufferably smug. He announced to his school friends that there was going to be a new baby at the Donnelly place with the pride of someone personally responsible for a significant accomplishment. The baby arrived in June of 1888 and was a girl, which delighted everyone including Thomas, who had made his peace with the gender lottery and was now very invested in having someone to teach reading to. They named her Eleanor June Eleanor for Ralph's first wife, because Margaret had suggested it one evening in the spring, and Ralph had been silent for so long that she thought she'd said the wrong thing, and then he had said, very quietly, "You do that." And she had said, "She was part of your life and you loved her and that deserves to be remembered." And he had held her in the way he held her when he couldn't find words. Eleanor June Donnelly arrived in the world with enormous dark eyes and a small, fierce mouth, and an immediate conviction that the world owed her full attention, which it mostly provided. James was 5.5 and took to his sister with possessive devotion, sitting beside her cradle and guarding it from perceived threats with the moral authority of someone who had recently been the youngest and knew how important that position was. He reported on her welfare to Ralph with the seriousness of a young cowboy making a trail report, and Ralph listened to every word with perfect solemnity. "She slept for a long time," James informed him one morning. "That's what babies do," Ralph said. "Is that all they do?" For a while, James considered this. "When does she start doing things?" "Soon," Ralph said, "and then she won't stop." This prediction proved accurate. Eleanor June had opinions about everything by the time she was 10 months old, conveyed through a system of gestures, sounds, and expressions of withering disappointment that had the whole family both charmed and slightly intimidated. The Donnelly household settled into the rhythms of a family that had been built rather than simply happened. The rhythms of morning coffee and evening meals, and the particular constellation of voices that belong to a specific place, to a specific gathering of people who have chosen to be together. Margaret sat on the porch in the long summer evening sometimes, and listened to it all. Thomas in the corral with the horses, Ralph's voice low and clear from somewhere on the property, James shouting something at Thomas that Thomas was ignoring with practiced ease, Eleanor June in the crib on the porch producing small opinionated sounds. And she thought about October of 1882 and a widow shaking at the back of a church. She thought about what she had believed then about the future, which was mostly that she could not see one. She thought about the $42 and the leaking roof and the enormous cold weight of being entirely alone. She thought about a man she barely knew standing up from a pew and walking to the back of a church to stand beside her because he saw that she needed someone to stand beside her. And that one quiet act, that one unremarkable, extraordinary act of decency, and all that had come from it. She had once thought in those first hard months that love the second time would feel like a lesser thing, diluted by loss, qualified by experience, something more measured and careful than the clean first love of youth. She had been wrong about that, profoundly wrong, in the way that the deepest discoveries of a life are always a surprise. Love the second time, love built on the ruins of loss and raised again with all that knowledge in the foundation, was not less. It was more. It was the kind of love that knows what it is and what it has cost and chooses itself anyway, every day, with eyes open. She loved Ralph Donnelly with every clear-eyed, chosen, experienced part of herself. She loved him for his steadiness and his patience, and the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, and the way he had become, without apparent effort and through sheer consistent goodness, the truest father she could have imagined for her children. All her children, Thomas, who carried William Rhodes in his brown eyes and Ralph Donnelly in his way of standing, his way of working, his way of being a man. James, who was his father's son in his bones and his mother's son in his heart. Eleanor June, who was her own thing entirely and would clearly be a force of considerable reckoning. On a September evening in 1889, 7 years after they had married, Ralph came to find her on the porch as the sun went down over the Kansas plain, that particular September light that is gold all the way through, and he sat beside her in the second chair, and they watched the light for a while without speaking, because they had arrived at the place in a marriage where silence is a form of conversation, where presence alone says the necessary things. 7 years, he said. 7 years, she agreed. I was going to say something profound, he said. What happened to that plan? He looked at her sideways. I couldn't think of anything that covered it. She reached over and took his hand, the hand she knew as well as she knew her own by now, the broad palm and the calluses in the right places and the scar on the right knuckle from a wire fence that had caught him badly 2 winters ago. You stood up from a pew, she said. He looked at her. That's where it started, she said. You stood up and you came to the back of a church and you stood beside me when I was shaking, and you didn't say anything and you didn't make a production of it and you just stood there. And everything came from that. She looked at him steadily. I have never forgotten that. I don't think I ever will. Ralph was quiet for a moment. The light moved across the plain. You looked like someone who needed someone to stand beside them, he said simply. And I had nothing else to do that was more important. She laughed softly. You are the most understated man I have ever known. Is that a complaint? It is absolutely not a complaint. Thomas appeared around the side of the house then, 16 and long-limbed, and moving with the easy confidence of a young man who has grown up knowing where he belongs. And he looked at his parents sitting on the porch in the September gold, and he must have read something in the quality of the moment because he stopped. Should I come back later? He said. Come sit, Margaret said, and he came and sat on the porch steps, long legs stretched out, and after a moment James appeared from wherever James always appeared from. He had the particular gift of materializing when something interesting was happening, and sat beside Thomas on the steps, and they could hear Eleanor June in the house through the open window, talking to herself with the confident monologue of a 1-year-old who has decided she has important things to say. The 5 of them sat in the September evening with the Kansas sky going from gold to pink to the particular soft blue of late dusk, and the horses were quiet in the corral, and the cattle were settled and the corn in the field had been harvested and the property was whole and sound. Thomas said, to no one in particular, "It's a good spread." "It is," Ralph said. "Papa," James said, "James Colton at school says you're the best horseman in the county." "James Colton hasn't seen your mother on a horse," Ralph said. Margaret tilted her head at him. "That's very flattering and not even remotely true." "It is true and you know it," Ralph said. "His mother can beat everyone," Thomas agreed, with the definitive tone of someone settling a matter. James considered this information with the weight it deserved. Then we're the best family in the county, he determined. Ralph looked at Margaret over the tops of their sons' heads, across the September air, and his gray eyes held that look she had learned in 7 years to read exactly, warm and steady and sure, the look of a man who knows precisely where he is and would not be anywhere else. "Yes," he said, and the word was so quiet she nearly missed it under the sound of the cooling evening. "We are." Eleanor June began to make louder sounds from inside the house, sounds that indicated that dinner was probably overdue from her perspective, and Thomas got up first and went inside to check on her, and James followed because James followed Thomas everywhere and probably always would, and Ralph and Margaret sat alone for 1 more minute on the porch as the light finally finished its journey, and the stars began their work overhead. Margaret thought about 7 years and all the work and all the cold mornings and all the things they had figured out and all the things that had happened that they couldn't have planned for, and she thought about the woman she had been standing at the back of that church in October of 1882 with her hand shaking around her small son's fingers, unable to see a future. She had found one. She had built one, day by day and season by season, out of stubbornness and love, and one man's act of simple, unremarkable grace. The act of standing up and walking towards someone who needed someone to walk toward them. That was all it had been. That was all any of it had needed to be. She squeezed Ralph's hand and stood up. "Dinner," she said. He stood. He was still tall, still the solid, sure-limbed man he had always been, with more gray at the temples now and a few more years' worth of sun in his face, and he looked at her in the dusk and she thought, "I would choose this again. I would choose every difficult inch of the road that brought me here." "Margaret," he said. "Ralph," she said. He brought his hand up and touched her face the way he sometimes did, as if checking that she was real, and she leaned briefly into his palm. And then Alina June's opinion about the delay in dinner became too loud to ignore, and they went inside to their family. The homestead was lit from within, warm light through those 4 glass panes in the parlor window, gold against the darkening prairie. And from the road, if anyone had been riding past on that September evening in 1889, if anyone had looked up at the right moment, it would have looked exactly like what it was. A house full of life, a place where people had chosen each other and kept choosing each other, where love had been built from the ground up and taken root deep enough to last, where a widow who had once stood shaking at the back of a church was now thoroughly, entirely, and permanently home. The years turned, as they do, with kindness, and the Donnelly place became something the county spoke of, not just because of the quality of the cattle or the good corn harvest or Ralph Donnelly's reputation as a fair-dealing, honest man, but because of what it was when you came to it, a place that felt like something real. People came for supper and left feeling steadier. Thomas grew into a young man the whole town had an opinion about, all the opinions good ones. James became Thomas's shadow grown into his own shape, quieter than his brother but with a depth that Ralph recognized and tended carefully. Alina June became Alina June in full, which was a thing unto itself. And Ralph and Margaret Donnelly grew old together in the slow, unhurried way of people who have time because they have stopped being afraid of losing it. 2 people on a porch in the evening and the morning, in the long, ordinary middle hours of a life that was more than enough. That was everything. That had started in a church when a man stood up and walked to the back and stood beside a woman who was shaking, and neither of them had known in that moment what it would become. What it became was this. What it became was everything.